Hey everybody, this is chapter 10 of Z.A. Jordan's The Evolution of Dialectical Materialism, Philosophical and Sociological Analysis. The chapter 10 is titled The Sociological Approach of Engels. It is usually held to be self-evident that Marx's and Engels' views on historical materialism can be combined into a single undifferentiated whole. At the same time, there is a tendency to treat Engels' presentation of the materialist conception of history as little more than an exegetical or popular exposition of the doctrine to be found in its theoretical and complete form only in Marx. It has been pointed out earlier that owing to his admirable modesty, Engels himself falls to this attitude towards his work, an attitude spread among students of Marxian doctrines today. This view of Engels is not altogether just or right, and never less so than with respect to his part in the discovery of the materialist conception of history. Section 1. Engels' contribution to the materialist conception of history. In his essay on the history of the Communist League, published in 1885, Engels referred to his first stay in Manchester between 1842 and 1844. When, quote, "It was tangibly brought home to me that the economic facts, which have so far played no role or only a contemptible role in the writing of history, are at least in the modern world a decisive historical force. That the economic facts form the basis of the origination of the present-day class antagonism, that these class antagonisms in the countries where they have become fully developed, thanks to large-scale industry, hence especially in England, are in their turn the basis of the formation of political parties and of party struggles, and thus of all political history," end quote. Engels. When on his way back from England to Germany, Engels visited Marx in Paris in the summer of 1844 with the manuscript of The Condition of the Working Class in England ready for print. He and Marx discovered, quote, their complete agreement in all theoretical fields, end quote. According to Engels, in his essays published in Deutsch-Französische Jahrbucher in 1844, footnote, Engels refers to KHR, which I can't remember what that's shortened for, which of course should be evaluated as Marx himself insisted in the preface to the contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, together with Kritik der Hegelschen Staatsphilosophie. Maybe that's Critique of Hegel's philosophy, right? According to Ryazanov, the latter was written in March 1843 at the earliest, but Siegfried Landshut, the editor of Marx's Frühschriften, believes that this terminus a quo should be shifted back to 1841-42. End footnote. Marx not only arrived, quote, at the same view, end quote, about the role played by economic facts in the modern world, but also generalized it to the effect that, quote, it is not the state which conditions and regulates civil society, but civil society which conditions and regulates the state, end quote. 1 year later they met again in Brussels, and Marx, as Engels reported, quote, had already fully developed his materialist theory of history and its main features from the above-mentioned basis, end quote. What Engels described as the fully developed theory is to be found in the Holy Family and the German ideology. From then onward, quote, we applied ourselves, end quote, Engels noted, quote, to the detailed elaboration of the newly won mode of outlook in the most varied directions, end quote. Engels' own account concerning the development of his ideas before 1845 is corroborated by the content of his early publication and is in agreement with Marx's testimony. In his preface to A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, and in his introduction to Engels' Socialisme utopique et socialisme scientifique, Marx recognized the independence of Engels' ideas and Engels' genuine contribution to scientific socialism, in particular in his outlines of a critique of political economy from 1844 and the condition of the working class in England. It is clear from these accounts that only the second, the substantive formulation of the materialist conception of history, could be considered as Marx's exclusive property. The first, the methodological formulation, is the joint achievement of Marx and Engels. The independence and originality of Engels' contribution to the materialist conception of history is still preserved in his early publications, and of much of what he said on the materialist conception later in life, when he provided, as is so frequently claimed, solely an exegesis of Marx's great discovery. In Anti-Düring, and even more strikingly in Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific, Engels gave his views on the intellectual and social background of the materialist conception of history. On the intellectual level, the materialist conception arose from the rejection of the old materialism, which, quote, looked upon all previous history as a crude heap of irrationality and violence, end quote. In contradistinction to the views of the Enlightenment, 19th century materialism saw in history, quote, the process of evolution of humanity, end quote, and aimed at discovering its laws. Engels attributed the change to the new intellectual climate brought about by the replacement of the metaphysical by the dialectical conception of nature. In Engels' original sense of the expression, to be sharply distinguished from its later application, in particular from Stalin's use of it. The realization that we, quote, live not only in nature but also in society, end quote, inspired the effort to reconstruct the science of society on the same basis as the science of nature, that is, on the materialist foundation. At that time, Engels wrote, natural science made increasing use of the category of change, process, and development in its description of the world, and replaced the, quote, artificial interconnections, end quote, of events by the real ones discovered by observation and experiment. To be based on the evolutionary and naturalistic principle, the science of society should follow in the footsteps of natural science, do away in its own field with the, quote, fabricated interconnections, end quote, and try to discover the, quote, general laws of motion which assert themselves, in the history of human society, end quote. Engels, Anti-Düring. Engels' description of the program of 19th century materialism in the social and historical sciences strongly resembles the appeal made by the young Comte to the savants, to elevate social physics and the art of politics to the rank of positive science. They were to abandon the habit of considering ideas as personified abstractions and to connect facts by laws of a completely positive kind, arising from or confirmed by these facts. In Engels' view, it was not, however, the revolution in the concept of nature which exercised a decisive influence upon the reconstruction of the science of society on a new basis. The rise of a natural science of society was bound up with certain historical events occurring at that time. Quote, in 1831, the first working class rising took place in Lyon. Between 1838 and 1842, the first national working class movement, that of the English Chartists, reached its height. The class struggle between proletariat and bourgeoisie came to the front in the history of the most advanced countries of Europe. Facts more and more strenuously gave the lie to the teachings of bourgeois economy as to the identity of the interests of capital and labor. As to the universal harmony and universal prosperity that would be the consequence of unbridled competition, end quote. Engels, Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific. Footnote. Engels' interpretation is accepted by social historians, although the revolutionary Canut of Lyon were craftsmen and small masters rather than proletarians in Engels' sense. See Eric Hobsbawm's The Age of Revolution. End footnote. These facts, concluded Engels, could not be reconciled with the idealist conception of history which ignored the economic relations, the conflict of class interests, the struggle of social classes, and their role in human life. Engels' excursion into the sociology of the materialist conception of history described in general terms his own road to its discovery. Unlike Marx, whose point of departure was the world of Hegelian abstractions, Engels based his view of history, conceived as the scene of the interplay and operation of antagonistic forces, on the observation of social developments in England and on a sociological analysis of current events. In contradistinction to Marx's investigations, which made use of philosophic procedures, Engels' approach to the problems of the science of society was concrete and sociological throughout. Whenever he explained the meaning and implications of the materialist conception of history, he was inclined to emphasize its sociological aspect and formulate it in terms of social classes, the struggle and conflict of their interests rather than in terms of basis and superstructure, or productive forces and relations of production. The emphasis attached to the sociological aspect of the materialist conception might have weakened somewhat during the time of Marx's ascendancy over Engels, but after Marx's death it came into its own again. Towards the end of his life, Engels increasingly concentrated on the observation and analysis of the social scene and drew his evidence in support of the materialist conception therefrom. In particular, Engels claimed that the Industrial Revolution, which since 1848 had seized the whole of the continent, had everywhere produced, quote, clarity in class relations, end quote, and so simplified the situation that, quote, one would have had to close one's eyes deliberately not to see in the fight of the three great classes, bracket, SC. The landed aristocracy, the bourgeoisie, and the proletariat, end bracket, and in the conflict of their interests, the driving force of modern history, end quote. Engels, Ludwig Feuerbach. Engels came close to the claim that in view of the ubiquity of the class struggle, the materialist conception of history was self-evident and thus in no need of further validation. Footnote. See Georg Plekhanov, Marxism, where the basic difference in Marx and Engels' approach to the problem of social change is strongly emphasized. Plekhanov seems to regard Engels' empirical and positivistic approach, however, as much inferior to Marx's Hegelian view of the historical process. End footnote. Engels' emphasis upon the class struggle was not only due to the fact that Engels discovered its function in history independently of Marx. Engels was convinced that in every historical epoch, the prevailing mode of economic production, the system of exchange, and the structure of society necessarily arising therefrom, form the basis upon which is built, and from which alone can be explained, the political and intellectual history of that epoch. We cannot, however, apply this fundamental proposition of historical materialism to any social or historical situation unless we translate it into empirical language, which allows us to speak of observable objects, human behavior, social classes and their relations, that is, of the whole class system. The class system is the empirical basis of the Marxian theoretical propositions, which should be regarded, therefore, as a sociological theory of the social division, of the class division and class struggle. The Marxian explanatory and predictive principle is concerned with the division of labor, the relations of production, the property relations, or more generally, the mode of production and of exchange, establish certain structural and dynamic properties of society. But these properties are not empirically significant unless they are attributes of the individuals of the Marxian universe of discourse, that is, of social classes. In a simplified form, the fundamental proposition of the materialist conception of history can be stated in the words familiar from the Communist Manifesto that, quote, "The whole history of mankind since the dissolution of primitive society, holding land in common ownership, has been a history of class struggles," end quote. The relations into which men enter in order to produce their means of subsistence present themselves to them in the first place as antagonistic or incompatible interests. These interests determine the class divisions and the ensuing struggle of the classes. If we assume generally what is quite clear in some particular cases, namely that thoughts, ideals, legal, political, and other ideological forms are expressions of the underlying class divisions and conflicts that the latter are reflected, though in a distorted form, in the former, we arrive at the great law of motion of history. According to this law, which has the same significance for history as the law of the transformation of energy as for natural science, quote, "All historical struggles, whether they proceed in the political, religious, philosophical, or some other ideological domain, are in fact only the more or less clear expression of struggles of social classes," end quote. As Marx said, men become conscious of their economic conflicts and their ideas and beliefs, and fight their conflicts out by means of these ideas and beliefs. Engels' contribution to the materialist conception of history was that Engels provided it with an empirical and sociological significance. He covered the bare skeleton of its abstract Marxian formulation, familiar from the preface to a contribution to the critique of political economy, with the living flesh of social, historical, and cultural facts, and thus prevented the basic assumption, quote, "men make their own history," end quote, from disappearing into oblivion. Without the human agent acting on the stage of history, however, confused and deceived he might be about his own motives and objectives, no historiography and no philosophy of history can safeguard its profane, as Marx used to say, its realistic and common sense character. Engels never forgot that men make their own history. While Marx was the first to state that history is nothing but the activity of men in pursuit of their various ends, later Marx let this insight fall into limbo and looked at men, as Karl Popper rightly says, quote, "as mere puppets irresistibly pulled by economic wires," end quote. On this part, Engels never forgot that men make their own history and never treated them as symbols or the incarnation of some external force. It is important to emphasize this contribution of Engels, for Engels was also inclined, particularly in Marx's lifetime, but also later when he was left alone as the guardian of the doctrine, to regard the materialist conception of history as a philosophical theory of historical causation. Engels was anxious to discover what he variously called the, quote, "driving force," end quote, or the, quote, "moving power," end quote, of history, and was constantly searching for, quote, "the ultimate cause," end quote, the, quote, "determining factor," end quote, quote, "the ultimately decisive conditions," end quote, or primum agens of history. Impressed by Marx's historical studies, he felt it was the historian's most important task to lay bare the course of events in their interconnections, and to reduce this course of events to a necessary result of these interconnections. He thought that thereby history was shown to be a natural process. Marx also persuaded Engels that he had discovered the economic law of motion of modern society, and Engels never failed to emphasize this claim. Although historical events may appear to be subject to chance, quote, "history is governed by inner general laws," end quote. Engels' concern with the final cause or the ultimate decisive factor in history, and his insistence on the reduction of a sequence of events to, quote, "inner hidden laws," end quote, transformed a sociological hypothesis and a historical point of view into a speculative metaphysical doctrine, with the appearance but not the substance of a scientific theory. Besides the sociological and metaphysical approaches to the fundamental proposition of historical materialism, which Engels may have considered as supporting each other, there is also a methodological interpretation to be found in Engels. Thus, in the housing question, Engels defined the materialist conception of history as a procedure, quote, which explains all historical events and ideas, all politics, philosophy, and religion, from the material economic conditions of life of the historical period in question, end quote. Engels, the housing question. As Engels said, quote, to demonstrate the inner causal connection in the course of a development, end quote, is, quote, to trace political events back to effects of what were, in the final analysis, economic causes, end quote. That the materialist conception should be regarded as by Engels both as a substantive theory and a methodological procedure, the two approaches being indistinguishably merged in the exposition of historical materialism in anti-Düring, is perfectly comprehensible in view of his Hegelian apprenticeship. To apply the fundamental proposition of the materialist conception as a methodological rule is to establish the validity of this proposition as a substantive theory. 2. The revision of historical materialism. It was the methodological rather than the metaphysical interpretation of the materialist conception of history that led to its revision by Engels in the last 5 years of his life. Engels assumed responsibility for himself and for Marx for the misunderstandings to which their exposition of the materialist conception gave rise, and which reduced it to a monistic economic determinism. Engels' explanation of how the misunderstanding arose is plausible and convincing. We were so absorbed, he said, in substance, quote, in emphasizing the main principle vis-a-vis our adversaries, end quote, that we had neither time nor opportunity to consider in what way other factors than economic factors were involved in the process of interaction between the basis and the superstructure. The derivation of political, juridical, and other ideological notions from economic conditions became the distinctive feature of the materialist conception of history, and both its supporters and adversaries concluded that the materialist conception asserted no more than that. Footnote: Engels' letter to J. Bloch of the 21st to 22nd of September 1890, and to Franz Mehring on the 14th of July 1894, when John Plemenatz writes that Marx and Engels wanted, quote, to divide social activities into two main kinds, the economic and the rest, saying that the first kind determines the second, end quote. Parenthesis, John Plemenatz's Man in Society, Volume 2, end parenthesis. He once again ascribes to Marx and Engels a theory which Engels was so anxious to correct. End footnote. There is indeed very little in Marx's later writings which would suggest that he attributed a significant role to ideas, to human will and purposeful action in the course of history. As far as Engels is concerned, Edward Bernstein correctly observed that Engels, quote, originally assigned to the non-economic factors considerably less influence on the evolution of society, considerably less power of modifying by their action the conditions of production, end quote, than he did later in life. The quotes from Edward Bernstein evolutionary socialism. Footnote. Perhaps because of Bernstein's own revisions of the Marxian doctrine, Bernstein's assertion concerning Engels' revision of the original materialist conception of history was openly rejected as a pure invention by the representatives of, quote, orthodox, end quote, German Marxism. They accepted, however, the substance of Bernstein's views on the matter. That is, they accepted Engels' exposition and Bernstein's observations as Marx's own original views. End footnote. If the materialist conception of history is supposed to imply economic determinism, Engels wrote over and over again he wished to have nothing to do with it. Quote, according to the materialist conception of history, the ultimately determining element in history is the production and reproduction of real life. More than this, neither Marx nor I have ever asserted. Hence, if somebody twists this into saying that the economic element is the only determining element, he transforms the proposition into a meaningless, abstract, senseless phrase. Hanging together with this is the fatuous notion of the ideologist that because we deny an independent historical development to the various ideological spheres which play a part in history, we also deny them any effect upon history, ... Once a historic element has been brought into the world by other, ultimately economic causes, it can react on its environment and even on the causes that have given rise to it, end quote. Engels' letter to J. Bloch, 21st to 22nd September 1890, and to Franz Mehring, 14th of July 1893. Having rejected monistic economic determinism, Engels replaces monistic economic determinism by the principle of interaction between the sub and superstructure and the principle of the relative independence of ideological factors. The revised materialist conception of history is thus transformed into a doctrine of a qualified economic determinism. The role of the material conditions of life in social and historical development is no longer prescriptive but only restrictive. In Engels' own terminology, the economic movement gets its way on the whole, is by far the most decisive, and asserts itself in the last resort. Engels mentioned the principle of the relative independence of ideological factors in Ludwig Feuerbach, where he maintained that though the realm of economic relations is decisive with respect to ideological forms or ideologies, the latter, the state, law, and religion in particular, are endowed with a relative independence and are capable of operating as causes of subsequent events. It is, however, in the letters written in connection with the revisions of the materialist conception of history that Engels dealt with this problem at length. Quote, the economic situation is the basis, but the various elements of the superstructure ... also exercise their influence upon the course of the historical struggle and in many cases preponderate in determining their form. There is an interaction of all those elements ... The political, juridical, philosophical, religious, literary, artistic, etc. development is based on economic development, but all these react upon one another and also upon the economic basis. It is not that the economic condition is the cause and alone active, while everything else only has a passive effect. There is rather interaction on the basis of economic necessity, which ultimately always asserts itself. End quote. Engels, letter to J. Bloch, 21st to 22nd of September 1890, and to H. Starkenberg, 25th of January 1894. See Engels' letter to Conrad Schmidt of 5th of August 1890. I don't know if I said footnote, but footnote and footnote. Back to the text. Engels emphasized the fact that even a genetically secondary element such as trade or money market, which is within the direct reach of influence of the substructure, may acquire, quote, special laws determined by its own nature in separate phases, end quote, and follow a, quote, development of its own, end quote. The relative independence with which the elements of the superstructure are endowed seem to increase in proportion to the distance from the economic base, which therefore least determines the pure and abstract form of ideology. For instance, trade is less independent in some respect of the mode of production than is the power of the state or the political system, and the latter are less independent than law and the higher ideologies such as religion and philosophy. The materialist mode of existence is the prime cause and determining factor in the relation between state power and economic conditions, law and production, conception of nature and economic necessity, philosophy and economic development. Nevertheless, the ideologies and ideological forms may, in virtue of their inherent relative independence, react upon the whole development of society or on the conditions and course of production, and within certain limits modify them. While on the whole the economic movement gets its way, it is also influenced by ideological movements which it had established itself and endowed with relative independence. The doctrine of a qualified economic determinism still singles out one variable factor: the state of the productive forces of society, which is assumed to determine decisively all forms of social relations, the political, juridical, and moral order, and the artistic, religious, and philosophical activity. However, the charge raised against the Marxian doctrine, that the Marxian doctrine isolates one single determinant, which in fact can never operate alone, and thus should never be set apart from others, no longer applies. Footnote. This charge can be found, for example, in John Dewey's Freedom and Culture and H.B. Acton, The Illusion of the Epoch. End footnote. Engels refused to accept such a, quote, hollow abstraction, end quote, and claimed that instead of isolating one single factor, producing, quote, an automatic effect, end quote, we should consider the whole vast social process as operating in the form of interaction in which various determinants, though of unequal force, are involved. To be a determinant is not necessarily to be genetically independent. According to Engels, when such determining factors as the political order, the system of laws, conceptions of the universe, natural science, or philosophy have once emerged, they can and do act in turn as causes. They are capable of originating new causal chains, of influencing social development, and even of modifying in some degree the economic advance, i.e. the operation of forces from which they derive. Thus, the economic movement does not act in isolation and is not a unique causal factor, but only, quote, the strongest, most primeval, and most decisive, end quote, in a number of interacting determinants. To assume that events follow each other in conformity to laws of succession, and that such sequences constitute a causal chain is, parenthesis, or rather used to be, end parenthesis, a logical postulate of scientific inquiry. But the idea that all such causal chains constitute a single whole, that they are ultimately attached to one factor only, the cause of all other causes, la grande cause, la cause universelle et permanente of 10, I think it's Charles 10, I'm not sure, and I think that's how you say his name, Taine, French, and that they are thus subject to one causal law is no longer a postulate of scientific inquiry, but the expression of an extra-scientific metaphysical principle. The revision of the materialist conception of history, accomplished by Engels, has done much to emancipate the materialist conception from this metaphysical principle, and to replace it by a methodological postulate. Instead of prescribing what must happen, the materialist conception states restrictively what cannot take place. Thus, the materialist conception of history turned back toward the original starting point of Marx, from which Marx himself had moved further and further away in his later years. That, quote, men make their own history, but they do not make it just as they please, end quote. Engels fully realized the implication of this revision. Quote, so it is not, end quote, Engels wrote, quote, as people try here and there conveniently to imagine, that the economic conditions produce an automatic effect. No, men make their history themselves, end quote. Engels. From a letter to H. Starkenberg, 25th of January, 1894. There was, however, one implication of the revision which Engels did not notice and which Edward Bernstein was again quick to observe, undermining the so-called scientific socialism in one of its important meanings. Once monistic economic determinism is abandoned, there is no other necessity in history and no methodological basis for historical prediction. There was, however, one implication of the revision which Engels did not notice and which Edward Bernstein was again quick to observe, undermining the so-called scientific socialism in one of its important meanings. Once monistic economic determinism is abandoned, there is no other necessity in history and no methodological basis for historical prediction. If history results from a number of interacting factors, there is no single law of succession of distinct stages in social and historical development. Thus, prediction turns into prophecy, and socialism, unable to foresee the future, is no longer a science in Engels' sense. Engels' views on the validation of historical materialism. It has been mentioned earlier that according to some scholars there was something obvious for Marx and Engels in the materialist conception of history. It is true that in his review of a contribution to the critique of political economy, Engels considered the proposition, quote, the social being of men determines men's consciousness, end quote, as, quote, so simple that it must be self-evident to anyone who is not bemused by idealist delusions, end quote. Engels. The expression, quote, self-evident, end quote, must have been, however, a slip of the pen. Quote, only a mass of critically sifted, completely mastered historical material, end quote, wrote Engels in the same article, can establish the validity of the materialist conception, quote, even in regard to a single historical example, end quote. In conformity with this view, Engels announced in 1890 that, quote, our conception of history is above all a guide to study, not a lever for construction of a la Hegelianism. All history must be studied afresh, end quote. Engels. In a letter to Conrad Schmidt, 5th of August, 1890. The materialist conception should be validated in the same manner as any other hypothesis or point of view in history, namely by showing that it does explain the events, fits the facts, and generally is a fruitful tool of research. It is true, however, that elsewhere Engels regarded the materialist conception of history not only as a hypothesis in need of confirmation, to, quote, be derived from history itself, end quote, but also a point of view which had been reliably verified. The confirming evidence was to be found in the class struggle in France, 1848 to 1850, the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, the Peasant War in Germany, and above all in Capital, with its analysis of the laws of the capitalist mode of production, the inevitableness of capitalism at a particular stage of history, and its inexorable downfall. The increasing role played in contemporary history by the class struggle, which in Engels' opinion could be seen more and more plainly in practically every European country, must also have appeared as a strong confirmation of the materialist conception. Quote, in modern history, at least it is ... proved that all political struggles are class struggles, and all class struggles for emancipation, despite their necessarily political form ... turn ultimately on the question of economic emancipation. End quote. Engels, Ludwig Feuerbach. Moreover, it should be conceded that on certain occasions, Engels went beyond the above described evaluation and argued that Marx actually, quote, proved that the whole of previous history is a history of class struggles, end quote. Engels. The proof mentioned in this extraordinary claim is a clear instance of the fallacy of the post hoc, ergo propter hoc, often uncritically repeated since its utterance by Engels. Post hoc ergo, according to Wikipedia, post hoc ergo propter hoc, quote, after this, therefore because of this, end quote, is an informal fallacy which one commits when one reasons since, quote, when one reasons, quote, since event Y followed event X, and event Y must have been caused by event X, end quote. It is a fallacy in which an event is presumed to have been caused by a closely preceding event merely on the grounds of temporal succession. This type of reasoning is fallacious because mere temporal succession does not display a causal connection. It is often shortened simply to post hoc fallacy, a logical fallacy of the questionable cause variety. It is subtly different from the fallacy cum hoc ergo propter hoc, parenthesis, quote, with this, therefore because of this, end quote, and parenthesis, in which two events occur simultaneously or chronological ordering is insignificant, or the chronological ordering is insignificant or unknown. Post hoc is a logical fallacy in which one event seems to be the cause of a latter because it occurred earlier. Post hoc is a particularly tempting error because correlation sometimes appears to suggest causality. The fallacy lies in the conclusion based solely on the order of events, rather than taking into account other factors, potentially responsible for the result that might rule out the connection. Post hoc ergo propter hoc is an easy fallacy to detect when it is blatant, but even the best of scientists and statesmen are occasionally misled by it. The fallacy might have been inspired by Marx's observation in the German ideology that, quote, men must be in a position to live in order to be able to make history, end quote. Since life requires, quote, eating and drinking, a habitation, clothing, and many other things, end quote, the first act of man in history must be concerned with the production of the means of subsistence and the preservation of life. Quote, this is indeed a historical act, end quote, Marx concluded, quote, a fundamental condition of all history which today, as 1,000 of years ago, must be accomplished every day and every hour merely in order to sustain human life, end quote. Every child knows, Marx observed in a letter to Dr. Kugelmann, that a country which ceased to work, even for a few weeks, would die. This basic law of life cannot be abolished. One can only change the form this law assumes. That in order to do anything else, men must first keep alive is a view worth emphasizing only in a historical review of the evolution of human society. In such a review, the insistence on a certain necessary time order in the whole range of human activity is inevitable. Engels was, of course, familiar with the idea that the materialist conception of history could be regarded as an evolutionary hypothesis concerning the development of man and society. In Dialectics of Nature, Engels implicitly suggested that the materialist conception could be conceived as a hypothesis of how man, the toolmaker, rose from the animal kingdom to acquire an increasing control over nature and thus civilize himself. This anthropological and historical approach could be used to explain how the making and using of tools resulted in the breaking up of the feudal society, the emergence and growth of the capitalist mode of production, and the transformation of the capitalist system into a new form of social life. The materialist conception would thus become a distinctive way of perceiving what happened in history and would provide a, quote, natural and reasonable explanation, end quote, of the rise of human civilization. As a purely evolutionary hypothesis, the materialist conception would carry its confirmation within itself. It would be entitled to demand acceptance if and so far as it could claim fruitfulness, objectivity, and a comprehensive scope of application. This is not the use which Engels tried to make of Marx's observation. Engels used the arguments which would support an evolutionary theory of society to validate a substantive social theory, and for this purpose, the time order, the temporal rhythm, and the natural succession of various human activities emphasized in the German ideology were entirely irrelevant. Engels failed to notice this and claimed that Marx discovered, quote, the simple fact, hitherto concealed by an overgrowth of ideology, that mankind must first of all eat, drink, have shelter, and clothing before it can pursue politics, science, art, religion, etc., that therefore the production of the immediate material means of subsistence, and consequently the degree of economic development attained by a given people, or during a given epoch, form the foundation upon which the state institutions, the legal conceptions, the ideas on art, and even on religion of the people concerned have been evolved, and in the light of which they must, therefore, be explained instead of vice versa, as had hitherto been the case, end quote. I'm going to guess that's German ideology, but let's see. Damn it, no. It says Engels SGM. I can't think of what that would stand for. The palpable but previously totally overlooked fact, as Engels put it, that before men can fight for power, prestige, and domination and indulge in their other pursuits, men must first work to produce their means of subsistence, does not place history on, quote, its real basis, end quote. The dictum, primum vivere deinde philosophari, does not establish the causal relationship, but only a temporal succession between living and philosophizing. It expresses the fact that in every type of civilization, certain activities are biologically determined by human anatomy, and that certain primary needs must be satisfied to secure the survival of the individual and the group. Says that Wikipedia says that primum vivere deinde philosophari, parenthesis, even if comma is not used, read with a caesura. Primum vivere deinde philosophari is a Latin quote that means, quote, first, bracket, think about, and bracket, living, then bracket about doing and bracket philosophy, end quote. A phrase that is sometimes repeated, even with an extended meaning, as a call for greater concreteness and greater adherence to the practical aspects of life. I had to translate that from the Italian Wikipedia. The dictum, quote, primum vivere deinde philosophari, end quote, does not establish the causal relationship, but only a temporal succession between living and philosophizing. It expresses the fact that in every type of civilization, certain activities are biologically determined by human anatomy, and that certain primary needs must be satisfied to secure the survival of the individuals in the group. It does not establish that Marx and Engels believed to be the case. What Marx and Engels believed to be the case, namely that the material conditions of life determine all forms of social activity and relations, political, legal, moral, artistic, scientific, or religious. Nobody in his right senses would deny that eating and drinking, just as breathing, the sexual act, or other physiological functions, are necessary conditions of man's other activities. This does not imply that any one of these necessary conditions, or even all of them taken together, are the sufficient conditions. That is, the cause and the sense relevant in this context of all other pursuits of man. It is clearly false to assert that the temporal succession emphasized by Engels provides the explanation of all historical phenomena, quote, in the simplest possible way. End quote. Finally, the Marxian way of validating the materialist conception of history is to be found in Engels. In Ludwig Feuerbach, Engels reached the conclusion that the motives and actions of human individuals were in relation to the total result, the ordered march of history of secondary importance only, that the struggle of the landed aristocracy, the bourgeoisie, and the proletariat was the driving force of modern history, that the origin of these classes and the development of their struggle lay clearly and palpably in purely economic causes, and that political power served merely as a means to the furtherance of class economic interests. This hypothesis revealed the intercausal connections of events, conferred significance upon them, and transformed their mere succession in time into a meaningful sequence. Once assumed, everything confirmed it, and it spread light and understanding not only on the past but also on the future. The examination of the, quote, historico-economic succession of events, end quote, would disclose what was bound to happen. Engels clearly claimed that the materialist conception of history was a valid theory of history because it corresponded with the development of events. 4. The relation of historical to dialectical materialism. Although Engels may have hesitated to assert with Lenin that the materialist conception of history is no longer a hypothesis, but a scientifically proven proposition, Engels believed implicitly in the materialist conception of history's truth. Quote, after history also was subjected to materialistic treatment, end quote, Engels commented without noticing the equivocal meaning of the term, quote, materialistic, end quote. Quote, a new avenue of development has opened, end quote. Engels. Ludwig Feuerbach. This new avenue was the possibility of inquiring into the nature and constitution of the universe as a whole, the prospect of demonstrating that the universe is uniformly material in the universe's nature and dialectical in its constitution. Thus Engels started a new departure not to be found anywhere in Marx, although it was Marx whom he named as having justified him in adventuring on the metaphysical construction. Thanks to Marx, quote, idealism was driven from its last refuge, the conception of history. A materialistic treatment of history was propounded, and a method found of explaining the consciousness of man by his being, instead of, as heretofore, his being by his consciousness, end quote. Engels, Anti-Düring. While Marx helped establish the material unity of the universe, comprising both the world of nature and the world of man, Engels alone extended the laws found in history to nature and conferred upon the universe as a whole ontological and dialectical uniformity. The, quote, general laws of motion, end quote, which according to Engels govern the development of nature, human society, and thought, are not those discovered in the historical process by Marx, but Hegel's laws of dialectics. Quote, I undertook the study of mathematics and natural science, end quote, Engels confessed, quote, to convince myself also in details of what in general I was not in doubt, that in nature, amid the welter of innumerable changes, the same dialectical laws of motion forced their way through as those which in history govern the apparent fortuitousness of events. The same laws as those which similarly form the thread running through the history of the development of human thought and gradually rise to consciousness in the mind of man. The laws which Hegel first developed in all-embracing but mystic form, in which we made it one of our aims to strip of this mystic form and to bring clearly before the mind in their complete simplicity and universality, end quote. Engels, Anti-Düring. Engels took advantage of the materialist conception of history and of Hegel's laws of dialectics to advance a metaphysical construction which was to comprise nature, society, history, and thought. According to Engels, genetically, dialectical materialism had its original roots in historical materialism. Logically, dialectical materialism is prior to historical materialism. However, contrary to what is so frequently asserted, neither Marx nor Engels deduced historical materialism from dialectical materialism, nor did either of them suggest that this inference can or should be made. But Engels prepared the ground for the claim of the deducibility of historical materialism from dialectical materialism, and thereby left to Engels' philosophical errors an inheritance fraught with intellectually disastrous consequences. That's the end of chapter 10. Thank you so much for